Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Should we retain statues honoring 18th or 19th century slave traders and imperialists? There are movements to bring down the statues of Confederate Generals in the US, to colonial rulers in Europe, to statues of Gandhi in Africa. Are they morally justified? And if they are, where do we draw the line? Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. To help us wade through these questions better are Rahul Rao and Poorna Swami. Rahul Rao is a senior lecturer at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Rahul grew up in Bangalore, doing his schooling and college here. Rahul, welcome.
Thanks.
Anchoring the conversation today is Poorna Swami, who is an independent writer and a journalist who joins us right here from Bangalore. Hi, Poorna. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And over to you.
All right. So I thought we'd begin by maybe setting up some context, which is that in recent weeks, as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen several statues of historical figures being vandalized or removed by protesters in various countries. In the US, we had statues of people such as Christopher Columbus and the Confederate President Jefferson Davis being taken down. In the UK, a statue of the slave trader Edward Colston was felled. And there has been for some years at Oxford, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, which is centered on a statue of apartheid architect Cecil Rhodes. And interestingly, a few years ago in Ghana, a statue of Gandhi, because of protests by faculty and students that Gandhi had been a racist towards African people, that statue was taken down. Now, you, Rahul, have written and spoken extensively about these movements, and generally you've been sympathetic to them. So let me begin by asking you, why must these statues fall?
Thanks, Poorna. I have generally been sympathetic to calls for the removal of statues of figures associated with colonialism, slavery, apartheid. And I think it's important to ask why these demands are articulated at the times that they are. And I think the answer is that usually it's because somebody has been able to tell a persuasive story connecting the historical figure depicted in the statue to some continuing, ongoing material injustice, typically connected with race and racism in the societies in which these controversies have erupted. So they're protests not just against what the 18th and 19th century figure did, but also about the persisting legacy of those actions in the present. In that regard, the statues are often a reminder not just of the past, but also of a continuing injustice. And so the demand for the removal of the statue is also a demand for societies to do something about that injustice in the present. And so I support many of these demands because I think they draw attention to issues that are too often marginalized or not talked about enough. And so in that sense, I see the demands around the statues as an entry point into a broader conversation, a way of drawing attention to highlighting issues that don't often get the attention that they deserve.
Right. You said that it's about the times we live in right now. But several critics have said that taking down these statues completely, that's sort of like erasing history altogether. Now, personally, I think that's a bit of a strange leap of logic, but I think we do have to question whether toppling statues in the present is essentially imposing our own political biases on what could perhaps be read as archives of the past.
One question to ask would be, do these statues actually tell a credible kind of history? Here, I think it's useful to think about the role that the Confederate statues play. Many of them depict figures who were central to the US Civil War between 1861 and 1865. But it's very interesting to note that a lot of these statues weren't built at the time of the Civil War or soon after the Civil War. They tended to be built in two waves much later on, about 50 years after the Civil War in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and about 100 years after the Civil War in the middle of the 20th century. And what's really key about these two moments is that these were both moments of white supremacist backlash against Black advancement. So the statues were really part of a kind of propagandist history, a way of rewriting the history of the Civil War, representing the actors who lost that war, that is the white southern states, as if they won. If you look at many of these statues, they display figures resplendent on horseback, high up on plinths. And looking at them, you'd think that these were the people who won the US Civil War, when actually they lost. You also forget that they were fighting to defend the institution of slavery, which is often misrepresented in these statues. So all this to say that the statues don't often tell a credible history. They tell a kind of revisionist, propagandist version of history. And so doing something to the statue, whether that's taking it down or contextualizing it, in a sense, actually allows us to tell a more critical history that does justice to what happened in that time. Now, there's another question you brought up, which I think is also very important, which is about whether we're judging these figures by the standards of our time. Now, when we speak of the time is always fractured. In any given time, people disagree with each other. And so even if when we think back to the 1860s and we look at statues of these figures like Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee, this is the same time in which great abolitionists like Frederick Douglass also lived. These were not unknown names. Frederick Douglass wrote an autobiography describing his life in captivity, his escape from slavery, and setting out his very powerful arguments against slavery. He lived in the same time. So when we speak of Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis as men of their time, what we're doing is we're effectively writing Frederick Douglass out of the same time, which I think is actually an inaccurate view of history. So I'm very suspicious of statements that take the form X or Y is a man of his time, because the time is always split and fractured. And I don't think there's any reason why we should remember the time solely through the views of the most powerful dominant figures who lived in that time.
I find this idea of rewriting and essentially writing history very important, because in a sense, the statues themselves were a way to write history. Right now, taking these statues down is also a kind of writing. But then, a lot of people say that if we are trying to write history differently or more fully, then is there a need to uproot these figures from public spaces? Perhaps we could add plaques that explain the problems with these figures, perhaps beside them or opposite them, erect statues of people who disagreed with them in their times. So I guess with the protests that are happening now, a lot of people are asking, is this the way? Can't we just add little appendages to what already exists?
All of the alternative strategies you describe are really interesting and definitely have a place in thinking about what we do with statues. But all of them also have limits, I think. And so we have to be quite contextual about which of these things might be appropriate in a particular situation. So let's take plaques. This is often suggested as a way of dealing with a controversial statue. You add a plaque that contextualizes the figure, that tells a more complicated history. The question is whether this changes the aesthetic impact of the object or the artifact. So as I described earlier, many of these statues are portrayed through an aesthetics of victory, right? These are statues that are built to glorify and honor somebody, not just to remember them in a critical fashion. And so the addition of a small plaque at the base of an immense monument may not do very much to disrupt the aesthetic triumphalism of the statue, if you like. Then people often suggest perhaps that they should be taken away to museums. And that's a very interesting possibility too. There are some excellent museums in places like Berlin, which house the kind of unwanted statues of the past in a very interesting way. But I've noticed that museum curators sometimes bristle at the way in which museums are invoked in these conversations as if they were readily available dumping grounds for the unwanted statues of the present. Some of the considerations are pragmatic. They don't have the space or the money to display all of these vast numbers of monuments that litter the built environment. Some of it is also about a worry that museums could then become rallying points for the flashpoints around statues that we're witnessing in public space. So museums are an interesting possibility, but I don't think it will be straightforward. And then I think you also mentioned building new statues of figures that the controversial historical figure disagreed with. So London's Parliament Square is a really interesting example of this. There's a statue of Churchill, but there's also a statue of Churchill's opponents, Gandhi and other people who lived later in time who would have disagreed massively with Churchill's views, Mandela, for example. Again, this is not straightforward because, as Pawan mentioned in the introduction, Gandhi himself has come up for criticism, and there has been at least one movement that has successfully agitated for a removal of a statue of Gandhi in Accra in Africa. So nobody is a straightforward embodiment of decolonization who would be acceptable to everybody.
You said, that the danger is that museums can become these contentious spaces, and they're not meant to be that necessarily. Also, I think something that's very important to think about is who has access to museums and who actually visits them. Because sure, museums can be free to the public, but there is always a certain kind of public that will go to them. Ideas of leisure and education, they change. And I think there is some kind of power in having the public space be a site of how we reflect upon history. And you use the word aesthetic. So I was thinking about something you've written earlier, where you say that you've written that statues are not merely symbolic and there is nothing mere about symbolism. And I found that a very interesting thought. Can you perhaps elaborate on that, especially in relationship to the idea of public space being the one thing that we can possibly all share in our cities?
I think what I was trying to get at with that statement was that statues are not only symbolic in the sense that the arguments that we are having over statues are also connected to material issues of injustice, of unequal distribution of resources, unequal representation in public spheres, and so forth. So there are very real material stakes. But I also said that, yes, they play a symbolic role, and there is nothing mere about symbolism. I'm always struck by phrases such as something being merely symbolic, or as if symbolism was a secondary issue. Symbolism is very important because it makes a statement about who belongs and who does not. If you identify with a symbol, if you consider yourself represented by that symbol, then you might feel a sense of acceptance within a political community. Whereas when you're alienated by that symbol, perhaps because the symbol is of a figure who oppressed your ancestors, then constantly looking at that symbol reiterates the historical injustice and makes you feel even more alienated from the society that you are expected to belong to. So in that sense, I think symbolism is not a secondary consideration. It's as important as the material stakes that are inherent in the statue arguments. You also made a really interesting point about publicness. And I think this is very important. You're absolutely right that museums are not free open spaces. They are accessible to a certain public. I'm always amused when museums like the British Museum talk about, making their objects available to the world, perhaps on their website. But even that, of course, we know about digital divides and people who can access information on websites and people who can't. But in terms of actually visiting the museum, first you have to get into Britain, which anyone who's applied for a visa knows is a horrendously difficult process. But coming back to publicness, the publicness of the statue is very important and is, I think, a reason why they have become terrains for this discussion around racism, colonialism, and apartheid. The publicness of the statue for me means two things. Unlike virtually every other medium of visual representation, whether it's a book or a film or a play, which requires an approach from the viewer or the reader, right? You as the viewer or the reader have to pick up the medium and consent to look at it. When it comes to statues do not require our consent. They kind of thrust themselves upon us, whether we like it or not. They're in your face. They're inescapable. But also, because they are in public space, unguarded, alone, they're vulnerable, right? So they're kind of simultaneously aggressive and insecure. And this, I think, makes them flashpoints for public anger. It also means that they become terrains that are more amenable to democratic reinscription. And by that, I mean that unlike rewriting history, which requires scholarship, immersion in certain protocols of knowledge production, expertise, etc., scribbling graffiti on a statue is something that anyone can do, right? Somebody who scribbles "was a racist" on a statue of Churchill has made a very powerful intervention in the public sphere. It's a bit like, for me, it's a bit like a Me Too tweet, right? It has the ability to dislodge a huge amount of received wisdom about a person or a historical figure in a way that's available to ordinary members of the public.
This thing that you mentioned about reinscription made me think about what is happening with the Robert E. Lee statue in Virginia right now. And the statue hasn't come down, but people have painted over it, and it's become a site of gathering. And, there are projections, and it's almost unrecognizable. And that reinscription, as it's unfolding before us, I feel is a very powerful image, and yet we have a media narrative that tends to emphasize the violence of the protests or the unbridled rise of the mobs. What do you think is the role of the media in how we today are thinking about these events that are unfolding in real time?
That's really fascinating. And I want to say a little bit about both what you were saying about reinscription, and then I'll come to the point about the media. So the statue of Robert E. Lee, that I think if it's the same one that you're talking about, because there are so many statues of Lee, especially in Virginia and the southern states, is on a massive plinth. It's really high up on Monument Avenue. The governor has announced an intention to remove the statue, but the whole process has been stalled by court cases and a legal injunction. So for now, the statue is still there. And you're right, people are gathering around it, scribbling graffiti around the base, projecting their own visions and ideas about what should be done to it even before it has gone. And that too, I think, is part of this process of having a democratic conversation about what to do with that statue in the future. It's not the kind of democracy that many people like. A lot of liberals don't like popular direct action. So when the statue of Colston in Bristol was brought down, not just brought down, but rolled down the street, covered in paint and dumped in the harbor, a lot of people said, yes, this is a statue that should have gone, but people should have followed due process. The truth is, people had been trying to follow due process for many years. There had been arguments in the city council, between the city council and other entities that wanted to keep the statue as it was, arguments over the wording of the plaque, what should be said about Colston, etc. And these had gone nowhere. And so Black Lives Matter protesters got tired of this and eventually took matters into their own hands. And I think what they did with the statue is also very interesting. For me, it's not incidental that they dumped him in the water, because I think what they were trying to do or signify was that the statue of Colston, remember, we're talking about an inanimate object here, not a live human being, but the statue of Colston was being made to suffer the same fate that thousands of the Africans that he had enslaved and transported had also suffered in what's called the Middle Passage, the movement over the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Americas. And this fate of Colston was not alone. There are many stories in the last few weeks of statues that have been beheaded, strangled, strung up from lampposts, drowned. There seems to be a desire to do to these figures, or to do to the inanimate representations of these figures, what they did to other people. And you could call this revenge, but you could also, I think, call it a kind of psychic repair or healing. Because, as I said earlier, no human being is being hurt by these moves. And so you might argue that actually this is quite a healthy way for societies to reckon with the past and to effect the kinds of transformation and possibly healing that they need in order to move beyond those events and to create a new world. This is not the narrative we're getting in the media. The media talks about what's happening to these statues as if mobs are lynching live human beings. And I think there is something both revealing about that, but also very limited, imaginatively limited about that way of describing what's happening in the present.
So you've said that these moments that we're seeing are a step towards transformation and healing. And I'm thinking about the statues of B.R. Ambedkar that are being erected all over India over the years. And there is obviously caste resistance to it. And it's not going to heal the injustices that, entire communities suffer and are continuing to suffer. But I feel like in India particularly, this idea of reclaiming space and, in a sense, healing the past gets mixed up in the odd idea of the cost of erecting statues. Yeah, I was wondering about your thoughts on that.
With the statues of Ambedkar, of which we have tens of thousands, right, all over the country, what work do those statues do? I think they do two kinds of things. First, they reclaim public space in quite a physical, material way. And that's important because we have to remember that keeping Dalits out of public space was or remains a central tool in the way in which they are oppressed and humiliated. And so the construction of a statue is a way of asserting control over space. And it's also a way of asserting Dalit pride and dignity in Ambedkar and reminding a broader Savarna public that they too owe a debt of gratitude to Ambedkar as the architect of the Indian Constitution. We talked about reconciliation and healing, but I think before we can even get to the point where such things are contemplable, first there has to be assertion. A group that feels it has been shut out of the public sphere, oppressed for centuries, has to be able to enter that public sphere in order to assert its demands on a plane of equality. And I think that's what the statue building projects try to do. They're a way of doing that very visibly in the built environment. Of course, Mayawati and many Dalit leaders have been criticized for building these statues at great expense. What's very interesting is that this has not impeded rival statue building projects, which are also extremely expensive. Think of the Statue of Unity, think of the money being spent on Shiv Smarak in Mumbai, and all of these proposals that keep coming up every week, month, to build a statue of Ram in Ayodhya and all sorts of figures everywhere. In the face of these rival statue building projects, some people have suggested a kind of moratorium. Nobody should build statues because they're a waste of money. Ram Guha recently made this kind of intervention. I disagree with that because it seems to posit a kind of moral equivalence between these rival statue building projects. It does not inquire into the histories of oppression and dispossession that might make it legitimate for some communities to build statues and perhaps less legitimate for others to do so. I think it's a difficult question to adjudicate, but I also think it's an abdication of responsibility to just say nobody should build statues anymore.
Right. I think something that gets mixed up in discussion is that, as some groups try to build certain statues, they are also in other people's eyes imposing a kind of xenophobic identity. So I'm thinking of, say, the Victoria statue in Bangalore, which is in Cubbon Park, and everyone's seen it. But you have a bunch of Kannada language and identity activists who've been campaigning to have this statue removed. And the statue is essentially a glorification of empire. So one could see that these activists are demanding a move towards decolonization. But at the same time, the rest of their campaign has an agenda that is trying to exclude, say, the Tamil citizens of the city. So how do you see this complex interaction between decolonizing and in erecting something else, possibly propagating xenophobia in this local context? I think the same would apply to the Shiv Sena wanting to erect certain statues of Maratha leaders.
This is really interesting and complicated. I think Janaki Nair has written about this very illuminatingly. And her account of this is that initially, when Kannada language groups raised demands for the removal of colonial statues, she mentions the demolition of a war memorial to British soldiers in 1964. Initially, the demand looked like it was being articulated against the remnants of British colonial presence. But over time, these groups have articulated their demands against the presence of other regional linguistic icons in Bangalore's public space. You may remember that for many years there was controversy over a statue of Tiruvalluvar, which could not be unveiled for a long time because of these protests by Kannada language groups against the presence of Tamil in the public sphere, whether it came to Tamil cinema or indeed this particular statue. And every time the Kaveri tribunal issued an order, the statue required protection because it became a flashpoint for tensions between Kannada and Tamil groups. So what looks like a decolonizing protest against the global hegemony of English can look like a chauvinistic protest against linguistic minorities in the region, in the city. And this means that something can be simultaneously a decolonizing and a recolonizing move. A lot depends on the audience at which it's directed. And here I think a lot of the BJP's renaming gestures are very clear in the audience to which they're directed. So when the Hindu right renames things, whether they are cities or buildings or roads, they will often replace a British colonial name or a Muslim name with a Hindu name. And in doing so, I think they're trying to send a signal not really to Britain, which is kind of long gone and is probably not even very relevant in these conversations in India, but they're trying to send a message to Indian Muslims and minorities and Dalits, signaling that they now live under a kind of Hindu supremacist dispensation. It's a way of asserting control, making a claim about being in charge. And in that sense, I think a lot of these decisions, rather than being decolonizing decisions, are actually making visible a kind of new assertion of dominance and supremacy.
Then how does one really come to a rule of thumb? Is there a rule of thumb? How do you decide that one cause is more worthy than the other, and who gets to decide?
I don't think there's a rule of thumb. I think the problem is that in a lot of these conversations, people are looking for a rule of thumb that will help them to adjudicate these different disputes and come up with a simple rule. And I think that, as our discussion has shown, the issues are so contextual. It depends on so many different variables, if you like, not just who is the figure being depicted in the statue, but why was the statue built? When was it built? Who built it? With what agenda? How do different groups within that place relate to it? How does the statue speak to their history, but also their present? What is the power balance between these different groups? All of these factors feed into controversies around statues and make a single rule of thumb very difficult. So what I try to do in my work is actually to illuminate this complexity. And that might be unsatisfactory for some because it doesn't provide a kind of foolproof rubric that we can simply apply to all situations and places. But hopefully it helps us articulate the questions or the issues that might be relevant to having this conversation. Remember, ultimately, the argument about the statue is really an argument about us. How do we, as different groups in society, relate to each other? And finding agreement on a statue ultimately requires adjudicating the differences that we have with each other in the present, which is, you could say, the more important task. And if an argument about a statue helps us to have that other conversation, then I think it can actually be quite valuable.
Thank you, Rahul, for an excellent conversation. And to those listening, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thanks, Poorna. I really enjoyed the questions and the conversation.
I couldn't agree with you more. Rahul, Poorna, thank you for that illuminating discussion and for taking the time to join us on BIC Talks. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.